The sky over Germany in the summer of 1944 was a deadly arena. Allied bombers filled the daylight hours, protected by swarms of escort fighters. The Luftwaffe, once dominant, was now fighting a losing battle for air superiority. But on July 25, 1944, something extraordinary happened. Allied pilots reported encounters with aircraft unlike anything they had ever seen. These machines moved with impossible speed, leaving trails of mystery in their wake. This is the story of the Messerschmitt Me 262, the world's first operational jet fighter. To understand the significance of the Me 262, we must first understand the context. By 1944, Germany was fighting on multiple fronts and the situation was desperate. The Allied strategic bombing campaign was systematically destroying German industry. American B-17s and B-24s flew by day, British Lancasters and Halifaxes by night. German fighter pilots, despite their skill and courage, were being overwhelmed. The P-51 Mustang, with its long range and excellent performance, had changed everything. Allied fighters could now escort bombers all the way to their targets and back. The Luftwaffe needed a technological breakthrough to survive. That breakthrough had actually been years in the making. The development of the Me-262 began in 1938, long before the war started. The Messerschmitt Company had been experimenting with jet propulsion technology. The concept was revolutionary. Instead of a propeller driven by a piston engine, the aircraft would be powered by turbojets that expelled hot gases at tremendous speed. The theoretical advantages were enormous: higher speeds, better high-altitude performance, and the ability to outrun and outmaneuver conventional fighters. But turning theory into reality proved extraordinarily difficult. The first prototype, the Me-262V1, made its maiden flight on April 18, 1941. However, this flight used a conventional piston engine as the jets weren't ready yet. It wasn't until July 18, 1942, that the Me-262 flew solely on jet power. Test pilot Fritz Wendel took the controls for this historic flight. The aircraft performed beautifully, reaching speeds that left observers in awe, but numerous technical problems delayed its entry into service. The Junkers Jumo 004 engines were temperamental and had very short operational lives. They required rare metals that were in short supply due to Germany's blockaded economy. The high temperatures generated by the jets caused frequent mechanical failures. Pilots had to learn entirely new flying techniques to handle the jet's characteristics. And then there was the interference from the highest levels of command. Adolf Hitler, upon seeing the Me-262, demanded it be converted into a bomber. This decision, made in November 1943, caused further delays and confusion. Fighter pilots and designers knew the aircraft's true potential lay in air combat, but Hitler was obsessed with retaliation for Allied bombing raids on German cities. Valuable time was wasted trying to adapt the fighter into a fast bomber role. Meanwhile, Allied intelligence had begun receiving reports of a new German jet aircraft. Reconnaissance photos showed unusual aircraft at Luftwaffe test facilities. The Allies knew something was coming, but they didn't know exactly what or when. Then came those fateful encounters in the summer of 1944. On July 25th, a British Mosquito reconnaissance aircraft was flying over Munich. The Mosquito, one of the fastest Allied aircraft, was considered relatively safe from interception. Suddenly, the pilot spotted an aircraft approaching at incredible speed. It had swept wings and no visible propeller. The German aircraft made a high-speed pass but didn't engage. The Mosquito pilot pushed his engines to maximum power and dove for cloud cover. He escaped, but the encounter left him shaken and amazed. This was the first confirmed sighting of a Me-262 by Allied forces. Intelligence officers listened to the report with a mixture of skepticism and concern. Could the Germans really have developed a jet fighter already? The following month brought more encounters, and these were more aggressive. On August 28, 1944, Me-262s attacked American bomber formations for the first time. The jets came from behind and above, diving through the formations at over 500 miles per hour. American gunners trained to track slower targets found the jets impossible to hit. The Me-262s were armed with 4 30mm cannons in the nose. These weapons had devastating firepower against the heavy bombers. A short burst could tear the wing off a B-17 or set its fuel tanks ablaze. But the early attacks were often ineffective due to lack of training and tactics. The jets were so fast that pilots had only seconds to aim and fire. Many passed through bomber formations without scoring any hits at all. The pilots themselves were still learning how to fight in a jet aircraft. Everything they had learned in conventional fighters had to be relearned for the Me-262. The acceleration was impressive, but turning at high speed was another matter entirely. The aircraft had a wide turning radius and could easily black out a pilot in tight turns. The engines took time to spool up, making throttle response sluggish. Sudden throttle movements could cause engine fires or compressor stalls. Landing was particularly dangerous due to the aircraft's high approach speed, and the Me-262 was extremely vulnerable during takeoff and landing. Allied commanders quickly identified this weakness and began targeting Me-262 airfields. P-51 Mustangs and P-47 Thunderbolts would patrol near known jet bases, waiting to catch the jets when they were slow and defenseless. This tactic, known as rat catching, proved highly effective. Many Me-262s were shot down within sight of their own runways. Despite these vulnerabilities, the Me-262 remained a formidable weapon in skilled hands. The Luftwaffe began forming specialized units equipped exclusively with the jet fighter. The most famous of these was Jagdverband 44, commanded by Adolf Galland. Galland was a legendary fighter ace who had clashed with Nazi leadership over tactics. He had been relieved of his position as general of fighters after criticizing Goering. But in early 1945, he was given command of an elite jet fighter squadron. Galland handpicked his pilots from the most experienced aces in the Luftwaffe, men like Johannes Steinhoff, Günter Lützow, and Gerhard Barkhorn. These pilots had hundreds of victories between them in conventional aircraft. Now they would learn to master the jet and develop new tactics. Galland's unit was based at Munich-Riem airfield in the final months of the war. The pilots lived in constant danger from Allied air raids and advancing ground forces. Fuel and spare parts were desperately scarce and every mission was precious. But when they got airborne, the Me-262 pilots were like gods of the sky. They would climb to altitude, spot an incoming bomber formation, and plan their attack. The standard tactic was to approach from high and behind, using the sun for cover. Then they would accelerate to maximum speed and dive through the bomber formation. The closing speed was so high that gunners barely had time to register the threat. The Me-262 pilot would select a target, fire a brief burst, and zoom away. The entire attack lasted just seconds, but the results could be devastating. American bomber crews learned to fear the distinctive roar of the Jumo engines. That sound meant death was approaching at over 500 miles per hour. Some pilots described the Me-262 attacks as like being struck by lightning. One moment the sky was clear, the next their aircraft was on fire. The psychological impact of the Me-262 was significant, even if the numbers were small. Allied airmen knew that conventional tactics were useless against the jets. A P-51 Mustang could outmaneuver a Me-262 but could never catch one in level flight. The only hope was to catch the jet at a disadvantage or outnumber it. Some Allied pilots did manage to shoot down Me-262s in combat. The first confirmed aerial victory over an Me-262 came on October 7, 1944. Lieutenant Urban Drew of the 361st Fighter Group spotted two Me-262s taking off. He dove on them while they were still accelerating and shot down both aircraft. This confirmed what tacticians suspected. The jets were vulnerable during takeoff. Another famous victory came on March 31, 1945. First Lieutenant James Howard of the 356th Fighter Group engaged in a Me-262. The jet pilot made the mistake of trying to turn with Howard's P-51 Mustang. In a turning fight, the conventional fighter had the advantage. Howard stayed glued to the Me-262's tail and shot it down with a sustained burst. These victories were celebrated, but they were rare exceptions. Most Me-262 pilots who were lost fell victim to anti-aircraft fire, mechanical failure, or being caught on the ground during strafing attacks. The Luftwaffe's other major jet-equipped unit was Kommando Nowotny. This unit was named after Major Walter Nowotny, one of Germany's highest-scoring aces. Nowotny had over 250 victories and was considered a national hero. He was tasked with developing operational tactics for the Me-262 in late 1944. The unit was based at Achmar and Hessepi airfields in northwestern Germany. From there, they would intercept American bomber formations heading into Germany. But the unit faced constant problems with supply, maintenance, and training. The ground crews were inexperienced with jet engines and made frequent mistakes. Spare parts were nearly impossible to obtain as Germany's infrastructure collapsed. Allied bombing raids damaged the airfields and destroyed aircraft on the ground. And the pilots were under immense pressure to achieve results immediately. On November 8, 1944, tragedy struck Kommando Nowotny. Walter Nowotny himself was shot down and killed during combat with American fighters. The exact circumstances of his death remain unclear to this day. Some accounts say he was hit by anti-aircraft fire, others that he suffered engine failure. What is certain is that one of Germany's greatest aces died in an Me-262, the aircraft that was supposed to turn the tide of the air war. Despite individual pilot skill and the aircraft's technological superiority, the Me-262 program was doomed by the realities of Germany's situation. Production was hampered by Allied bombing of factories and transportation networks. Approximately 1,400 Me-262s were built, but only a fraction ever saw combat. Many aircraft sat on factory airfields waiting for engines that never arrived. Others were destroyed on the ground by strafing attacks before they could fly. The chronic fuel shortage meant that even operational aircraft often couldn't fly. Pilots who had trained for months on the jet sat idle as fuel reserves dwindled, and the strategic situation was deteriorating too rapidly for the Me-262 to matter. By early 1945, Soviet forces were advancing from the east. American, British, and Canadian forces were crossing the Rhine from the west. Germany's territory was shrinking, and with it the ability to sustain military operations. Me-262 units were forced to relocate constantly as airfields fell to the advancing Allies. Each move meant lost aircraft, equipment, and precious time. Some of the most poignant stories from this period come from the pilots themselves. These men were fighting not for victory, which was clearly impossible, but from a sense of duty and professional pride. They knew Germany had lost the war, but they continued to fly and fight. Franz Stiegler, and Me-262 pilot with Jagdverband 44, later recalled the surreal experience of flying the world's most advanced fighter, while Germany crumbled around them. He described taking off from bomb-cratered runways, dodging Allied fighters, attacking bomber formations, and returning to find his base under attack. The contrast between the futuristic technology of the Me-262 and the collapse of Nazi Germany was stark and deeply ironic. Adolf Galland himself reflected on this paradox in his post-war writings. He noted that the Me-262 represented both a technological triumph and a strategic failure. If the aircraft had been available in large numbers in 1943 or early 1944, it might have significantly impacted the air war over Germany. But by the time it entered service in meaningful numbers, it was too late. Germany's industrial capacity was being systematically destroyed. The training pipeline for new pilots had broken down completely, and the Allies had achieved such overwhelming numerical superiority that even advanced technology couldn't bridge the gap. Nevertheless, the Me-262 did achieve some notable successes. Jagdverband 44 claimed over 50 Allied aircraft destroyed in just a few weeks of operation. Given that the unit rarely had more than a dozen operational aircraft, this was an impressive kill ratio. Individual pilots like Heinrich Erler scored multiple victories in the Me-262. Kurt Welter claimed 25 night victories flying in Me-262 equipped with radar. These successes demonstrated what the aircraft could have achieved under better circumstances. The Me-262 was also used in the bomber role, as Hitler had demanded. A two-seat version was developed with a bombardier position in the nose. These aircraft carried bombs instead of the full cannon armament. Kampfgeschwader 51 operated these bomber variants in early 1945. They attacked Allied positions during the Battle of the Bulge, and later targeted bridges over the Rhine. But the Me-262 was poorly suited to the bomber role. Its high speed made accurate bombing difficult, and the bomb load was relatively small. These missions had little strategic impact and were largely a waste of resources. The aircraft's true potential remained as an interceptor and air superiority fighter. As the war entered its final weeks, Me-262 operations became increasingly desperate. Pilots were flying multiple sorties per day, often with barely enough fuel to return. Ground crews performed miracles keeping aircraft flying with minimal spare parts. Some units were forced to cannibalize damaged aircraft to keep others operational. The Autobahn near Munich was used as an emergency runway when regular airfields were bombed. Aircraft were hidden in forests and under bridges to protect them from strafing attacks. But nothing could stop the inevitable collapse. On April 24, 1945, Jagdverband 44 flew its last mission. Adolf Galland himself was wounded during this sortie, taking 20mm cannon fragments in his knee. He managed to land his damaged Me-262 and survive the war. Within days, American forces overran Munich and captured the airfield. They found several Me-262s parked on the field out of fuel and abandoned. These aircraft would soon be shipped to the United States for evaluation. Similar scenes played out across Germany as the war ended. American, British, and Soviet forces captured Me-262s at various locations. Some aircraft were intact, others damaged or incomplete. Allied intelligence teams scrambled to gather as much technical data as possible. They interviewed German engineers and pilots, seeking to understand the jet's secrets. What they learned would influence jet fighter development for years to come. The Soviets were particularly aggressive in seizing German jet technology. They captured several Me-262s and an entire factory that had been producing them. German engineers and technicians were forcibly transported to the Soviet Union. There, they would help develop the first generation of Soviet jet fighters. The Americans also conducted extensive testing of captured Me-262s. Several aircraft were restored to flying condition at Wright Field in Ohio. American test pilots were impressed by the aircraft's performance. Robert Johnson, a former P-47 ace, flew an Me-262 and called it the most advanced fighter he had ever experienced. The British also captured and tested several Me-262s. They were particularly interested in comparing the Me-262 to their own jet projects. Britain had been developing jets in parallel with Germany, including the Gloucester Meteor. The Meteor had entered service in 1944 but was used primarily against V-1 flying bombs. It never faced Me-262s in combat, though both sides were aware of each other's jets. The technical evaluation of the Me-262 revealed both brilliance and compromise. The swept-wing design was aerodynamically advanced and would influence future jets. The tricycle landing gear was modern and provided good visibility during taxiing. The cockpit layout was generally well-designed, though some controls were awkwardly placed. The Jumo 004 engines, while revolutionary, were crude by later standards. They used mild steel for turbine blades instead of heat-resistant alloys. This was because Germany lacked access to nickel and other strategic materials. As a result, the engines had an operational life of only 10 to 25 hours. After that, they had to be completely rebuilt or replaced. This was a crippling limitation that prevented sustained operations. Allied engineers noted that with proper materials, the design could have been far more reliable. The armament of 4 Mk-108 cannons was devastatingly effective. Each 30mm shell weighed over half a pound and contained high explosive. A few hits could destroy a heavy bomber or tear apart a fighter aircraft. However, the cannons had a relatively low muzzle velocity. This made long-range gunnery difficult, especially at the Me-262's high speeds. Some pilots found the guns inadequate for the high-speed intercept role. Experiments were conducted with various alternative weapons. One variant mounted a massive 50mm cannon in the nose. Another was fitted with rocket mortars that fired upward at bombers overhead. There was even a variant with unguided air-to-air rockets mounted under the nose. These experiments showed the Germans were desperately searching for effective weapons. But most of these variants never progressed beyond the prototype stage. The war ended before they could be fully developed and deployed. One of the most interesting questions about the Me-262 is hypothetical. What if it had been available earlier and in greater numbers? Some historians argue it could have prolonged the war significantly. If hundreds of Me-262s had been operational in 1943, they might have inflicted unsustainable losses on Allied bomber forces. The strategic bombing campaign might have been forced to halt or scale back. This could have preserved German industry and prolonged the Nazi regime. However, other historians argue this scenario is unrealistic. Germany lacked the resources to mass-produce the Me-262 earlier. The technical challenges with the engines required years to solve. And even with more Me-262s, Germany faced overwhelming Allied superiority. The Allies could afford losses that Germany could not. Moreover, Allied air power was just one element of Germany's defeat. The Soviet advance in the East and Allied invasion in the West were decisive. No single weapon system, however advanced, could have changed that outcome. What is certain is that the Me-262 represented a glimpse of the future. It proved that jet propulsion was practical for military aircraft. It demonstrated that swept wings improved high-speed performance. And it showed that jet fighters could dominate piston-engine aircraft. Within a few years of the war's end, all major air forces were transitioning to jets. The Americans developed the F-86 Sabre, which featured swept wings inspired by German research. The Soviets produced the MiG-15, which also benefited from captured German technology. The British continued developing the Meteor and introduced new jets like the Hawker Hunter. The age of the jet fighter had arrived, and the Me-262 had shown the way. The legacy of the Me-262 extends beyond just technology. It also represents the complex moral questions surrounding advanced weapons. The aircraft was created by engineers and scientists working under the Nazi regime. Many of these individuals were not committed Nazis themselves. They were simply doing their jobs, advancing the frontiers of aeronautical science. But their work served a genocidal regime fighting an aggressive war. After the war, many German scientists and engineers were recruited by the Allies. This was known as Operation Paperclip in the United States. These individuals contributed to American and Soviet aerospace programs. Their knowledge helped develop everything from jet fighters to space rockets. This pragmatic approach reflected the emerging Cold War competition. Both superpowers wanted German expertise for themselves. The ethical implications of this policy have been debated ever since. For the pilots who flew the Me-262, the aircraft holds a special place in history. Many of them survived the war and later shared their experiences. Adolf Galland moved to Argentina after the war, then returned to Germany. He worked as an aviation consultant and wrote his memoirs, The First and the Last. In it, he described the Me-262 as both his greatest achievement and his greatest frustration. He maintained until his death in 1996 that the jet could have changed the war. Johannes Steinhoff also survived, though he was severely burned in a crash. He went on to serve in the post-war German Air Force and eventually commanded NATO forces. His career demonstrated how former Luftwaffe pilots were integrated into the Western Alliance. Franz Steigler, who had been a Me-262 pilot, later became famous for a different reason. He was the German pilot who spared a crippled American B-17 earlier in the war. Decades later, he reunited with the B-17 pilot in a touching story of reconciliation. These personal stories humanize the history of the Me-262. They remind us that behind every aircraft were individuals with complex motivations. Today, very few Me-262s survive in museums around the world. The Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum has an example on display. The Deutsches Museum in Munich features an Me-262 in their collection. The Royal Air Force Museum in London has one that was captured at the end of the war. Each of these aircraft is a tangible link to a pivotal moment in aviation history. Visitors can stand before them and contemplate the technological achievement they represent. In recent years, there have even been efforts to build flying replicas of the Me-262. A company in Texas built several reproductions using modern materials and engines. These aircraft allow modern pilots to experience what it was like to fly the historic jet. Those who have flown them report that the Me-262 is both thrilling and demanding. The acceleration is impressive even by today's standards. But the aircraft requires constant attention and precise handling. It's easy to understand why the original pilots needed extensive training. The impact of the Me-262 on popular culture has also been significant. The aircraft has appeared in countless books, documentaries, and films about World War II. It features prominently in discussions about wonder weapons and Nazi Germany's technology. Sometimes the Me-262 is portrayed as evidence that Germany was on the verge of victory. This interpretation is historically dubious but makes for compelling drama. In reality, as we've discussed, the Me-262 came too late to affect the war's outcome. For aviation enthusiasts and model builders, the Me-262 remains endlessly fascinating. Its distinctive appearance, with the engines mounted below the wings, makes it instantly recognizable. The shark-like nose and swept wings give it an aggressive, purposeful look. Even 8 decades after its first flight, the Me-262 looks fast standing still. The story of the Me-262 also intersects with several other what-if scenarios. What if Hitler hadn't insisted on the bomber variant? What if Germany had prioritized jet development earlier in the war? What if the Allies hadn't been so effective at targeting German industry? These questions are ultimately unanswerable, but they invite us to consider how technology and strategy interact in warfare. One thing is clear. The Me-262 was a revolutionary aircraft. It proved that jet propulsion was the future of military aviation. Within a decade of the war's end, piston engine fighters were obsolete. The Korean War, which began in 1950, saw extensive jet versus jet combat. American F-86 Sabres battled Soviet MiG-15s in dogfights over MiG Alley. Both aircraft incorporated lessons learned from the Me-262 and other German jets. The swept-wing configuration became standard for transonic and supersonic aircraft. The challenges of high-speed flight that Me-262 pilots encountered were systematically addressed by post-war designers. Engines became more powerful and reliable, and airframes were refined. By the 1950s, jets routinely exceeded the speed of sound. The Me-262 had opened the door to this new era. It's worth considering the experiences of Allied pilots who encountered the Me-262. For many, it was a shocking and frightening experience. American bomber crews had grown accustomed to defending against conventional fighters. They knew the capabilities of the Bf-109 and FW-190, but the Me-262 was something entirely different. The sound of the jets was unlike anything they had heard before. The roar of the Jumo engines was distinctive and ominous. When pilots reported hearing that sound, everyone in the formation tensed up. Gunners would scan the sky frantically, knowing they had only seconds to react. The jets appeared suddenly, attacked with devastating firepower, and disappeared before anyone could respond effectively. Some bomber crews felt helpless against the jets. Their defensive machine guns seemed inadequate against such high-speed targets. The psychological impact was significant, even if the actual losses were relatively small. Fighter pilots had a different perspective on the Me-262. They recognized it as a serious threat but also saw its vulnerabilities. Experienced fighter leaders quickly developed tactics to counter the jets. The key was to avoid engaging them in high-speed pursuits. Instead, Allied fighters would patrol near Me-262 bases. They would wait for the jets to take off or return from missions. At low altitude and speed, the Me-262 lost its primary advantage. A P-51 Mustang or P-47 Thunderbolt could easily outmaneuver a jet that was just taking off or approaching to land. This tactic, while effective, was also controversial. Some pilots felt it was unsporting to attack aircraft when they were most vulnerable, but this was total war, and survival trumped chivalry. The Luftwaffe tried to protect their jet bases with heavy anti-aircraft defenses. Flak batteries surrounded the airfields, creating deadly gauntlets for Allied fighters. But this couldn't completely prevent the rat-catching tactic from working. Many Me-262 pilots were lost during takeoff or landing attempts. Some were shot down literally within sight of their own runways. It must have been extraordinarily frustrating for German ground crews to watch their precious jets destroyed before they could even reach combat altitude. Another aspect of the Me-262 story involves the development of jet engines themselves. The Junkers Jumo 04 was not the only German jet engine of the war. BMW also developed the BMW 003, which powered other experimental aircraft. These engines represented the cutting edge of propulsion technology. The basic principles they used are still employed in modern jet engines. Air is drawn in through an intake, compressed, mixed with fuel and ignited, and expelled at high velocity to produce thrust. But the materials and engineering of 1940s Germany limited performance. Modern jet engines are vastly more powerful and reliable. They can operate for thousands of hours between overhauls. The Jumo 04, by contrast, needed rebuilding after just 25 hours of operation. This was partly due to the lack of heat-resistant alloys. The turbine blades would literally burn away during operation. German engineers tried using hollow blades to allow cooling air to flow through them. This technique is still used in modern engines, though with much better materials. The fuel system of the Jumo 04 was also problematic. It used a relatively primitive fuel control system that required careful handling. Pilots had to advance the throttle slowly to avoid flameouts or fires. In combat, this was a serious limitation. A pilot who needed sudden acceleration might not be able to get it. Or worse, the engine might flame out entirely, leaving the aircraft a glider. Several Me-262 pilots were forced to make emergency landings due to engine failures. Some of these incidents occurred during combat with fatal results. Despite these challenges, the Jumo 04 was a remarkable achievement. It proved that jet propulsion could be made practical for military aircraft, and it provided a foundation for all subsequent jet engine development. Engineers in Britain, America, and the Soviet Union studied captured Jumo engines. They learned from both its successes and its failures. The next generation of jet engines would be more powerful, more reliable, and incorporate lessons from the German experience. It's also worth noting that Germany developed other jet aircraft besides the Me-262. The Heinkel He-162, known as the Volksjäger or People's Fighter, was designed to be simpler and cheaper to build than the Me-262. It had a single jet engine mounted on top of the fuselage. The idea was to mass-produce thousands of these fighters and pilot them with hastily trained volunteers. Only a few He-162s saw combat before the war ended. The aircraft was fast but extremely difficult to fly. Several pilots were killed during test flights due to structural failures. The Me-163 Comet was another extraordinary German aircraft. It was a rocket-powered interceptor, not a jet, but it shared the Me-262's futuristic nature. The Comet could reach speeds over 600 miles per hour, but its powered endurance was less than 8 minutes. After that, it became a glider and had to land at a vulnerable low speed. The Comet was also extremely dangerous to its own pilots. The rocket fuel was highly corrosive and explosive. Several pilots died in accidents related to fuel leaks or explosions. Compared to these radical designs, the Me-262 was relatively conventional. It used proven aerodynamic principles and a layout similar to traditional fighters. The revolutionary aspect was the propulsion system, not the overall design. This conservative approach was probably wise as it made the aircraft more practical. The Me-262 could operate from regular airfields with minimal special equipment. It could be maintained by mechanics with some additional training, and pilots could transition to it from conventional fighters with reasonable effort. These practical considerations made the Me-262 more successful than more radical designs. As we near the end of our story, it's important to reflect on what the Me-262 means today. For historians, it represents a fascinating case study in technology and warfare. It shows how innovation can occur even in desperate circumstances. But it also demonstrates that technology alone cannot overcome strategic failures. Germany's military situation in 1944 and 1945 was fundamentally untenable. No single weapon, no matter how advanced, could have changed that reality. For aviation enthusiasts, the Me-262 represents a milestone in flight. It was the first operational jet fighter, marking the end of one era and the beginning of another. Every jet aircraft that followed owes something to the Me-262. From the F-86 Sabre to the F-22 Raptor, the lineage is clear. For the veterans who flew or encountered the Me-262, it holds deeply personal meaning. German pilots remember it as a technological marvel that came too late. Allied pilots remember it as a dangerous adversary that demanded respect. As those veterans have passed away, their stories have been preserved in books and documentaries. We are fortunate to have their first-hand accounts of this remarkable aircraft. The Me-262 also serves as a reminder of the darker side of technological progress. Advanced weapons can be created by regimes pursuing evil ends. The engineers who designed the Me-262 were brilliant, but they served Nazi Germany. This creates ethical questions that remain relevant today. How should we judge those who create weapons for authoritarian governments? Can we separate the technology from the context in which it was developed? These are not easy questions, and there are no simple answers. What we can say is that the Me-262 emerged from a specific historical moment. It was created during humanity's most destructive conflict. The war accelerated technological development in countless ways. Radar, rockets, computers, and nuclear weapons all emerged during this period. The Me-262 was part of this wave of innovation driven by military necessity. In the decades since World War II, jet aviation has transformed the world. Commercial jet airliners have made global travel routine and affordable. Military jets have become ever faster, more capable, and more expensive. The latest fighters feature stealth technology, advanced sensors, and computer control systems. They are unimaginably more sophisticated than the Me-262, yet they all trace their ancestry back to those pioneering jets of the 1940s. The Me-262 proved the concept that has dominated military aviation ever since. Speed and energy management are fundamental to air combat. The pilot who can control the engagement tempo has a decisive advantage. Modern fighter tactics still revolve around these principles. The term energy fighter describes aircraft that use superior speed and climb rate. This concept was pioneered by Me-262 pilots who learned to avoid turning fights. They would make slashing attacks using their speed, then escape before counterattack. This boom and zoom tactic became standard for jet fighters. Looking at the Me-262 today, we can appreciate both what it achieved and what it might have achieved under different circumstances. It was a groundbreaking aircraft that came too late to change the war's outcome, but it changed aviation forever, demonstrating the potential of jet propulsion. For the Allied pilots who encountered it, the Me-262 was a shock. It represented a quantum leap in performance that seemed almost impossible. How could an aircraft be so much faster than everything else in the sky? The answer lay in the revolutionary propulsion system. Once they understood this, Allied engineers raced to develop their own jets. The British had actually beaten the Germans to the first jet flight. The Gloster E-28-39 flew in May 1941, powered by a Whittle engine. But Britain was slower to develop an operational jet fighter. The Gloster Meteor entered service in July 1944, slightly after the Me-262. The Americans received a Whittle engine and quickly developed their own jets. The Bell P-59 era Comet flew in 1942 but had poor performance. The Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star was more successful. It entered service in early 1945, just as the war in Europe was ending. A few P-80s were deployed to Italy but saw no combat, so the Me-262 and Meteor were the only jets to see significant combat in World War II, and the Me-262 saw far more action than the Meteor. This gives the German jet a unique place in aviation history. It was the first jet to prove itself in the crucible of combat. The lessons learned from Me-262 operations influenced post-war jet development. Designers understood the importance of reliable engines. They recognized that high landing speeds required long runways and skilled pilots. They learned that armament needed to be matched to the high closing speeds. And they discovered that new tactics were needed for jet combat. All of these lessons came at a high cost during the final year of World War II. German and Allied pilots died as the technology was proven in battle. Their sacrifice contributed to the safety and effectiveness of later jets. Today, when we board a commercial airliner powered by turbofan engines, we are benefiting from technology pioneered by the Me-262 and its contemporaries. The basic principle of jet propulsion remains unchanged. Air is compressed, fuel is burned, and hot gases produce thrust. The execution is far more sophisticated now, but the concept is the same. In military aviation, the Me-262's influence is even more direct. Every jet fighter can trace its lineage back to those pioneering aircraft. The challenges Me-262 pilots faced are still relevant today. How do you fight effectively at high speeds? How do you balance speed, maneuverability, and firepower? How do you train pilots for advanced aircraft? These questions were first seriously addressed in the context of the Me-262. As we conclude this story, we should remember the human dimension. Behind every Me-262 encounter was a pilot making life-or-death decisions. Young men, barely out of their teens in some cases, were entrusted with the world's most advanced fighter aircraft. They flew in a war that their nation was losing. Many of them knew that defeat was inevitable, yet they continued to fly driven by duty, pride, or simply the desire to survive. On the Allied side, bomber crews and fighter pilots faced a new and terrifying threat. The appearance of the Me-262 added new danger to already perilous missions. These men showed remarkable courage in continuing their missions. Despite the presence of this formidable weapon, the story of the Me-262 is ultimately a human story. It's about innovation under pressure, courage in the face of overwhelming odds, and the inexorable march of technological progress. The aircraft itself was a remarkable machine. Its swept wings, powerful engines, and heavy armament made it the most advanced fighter of its time. But it arrived too late and in too few numbers to alter history. Germany's defeat was assured by strategic overreach and Allied determination. No wonder weapon could have changed that fundamental reality. Yet the Me-262's legacy endures. It proved that jet propulsion was practical and effective. It demonstrated design principles that would dominate aviation for decades. And it provided a glimpse of the future at a moment when the present was consumed by war. When we look at the Me-262 today, we see more than just an aircraft. We see a turning point in aviation history. We see the courage and skill of the pilots who flew it. We see the ingenuity of the engineers who designed it. And we see the complex legacy of technology developed during wartime. The first encounters with the Me-262 were moments of shock and awe. Allied pilots could hardly believe what they were seeing. An aircraft that could outrun anything in the sky. A fighter that seemed to come from the future. These encounters changed how people thought about air combat. The age of the propeller-driven fighter was clearly ending. The jet age had begun and there was no going back. In the 8 decades since the Me-262 first flew, aviation has advanced in ways that would have seemed like magic to those early jet pilots. Modern fighters can break the sound barrier with ease. They carry radar-guided missiles that can hit targets beyond visual range. They feature fly-by-wire controls and advanced avionics. Some are invisible to radar, true stealth aircraft. Yet all of them owe a debt to the Me-262. That first operational jet fighter showed the way forward. It proved that jets were not just theoretical curiosities. They could be practical military weapons. The Me-262 blazed a trail that countless aircraft have followed. From the F-86 Sabre that fought over Korea, to the MiG-21 that served in air forces around the world, to the F-15 Eagle that dominated the skies for decades, to the F-35 Lightning II that represents current technology. The lineage is clear and unbroken. The story of the Me-262 reminds us that innovation often occurs during times of great stress and conflict. War accelerates technological development in ways that peacetime cannot match. The urgency of survival drives creativity and risk-taking. But we should also remember the cost. Every technological advance during wartime comes at the price of human suffering. The Me-262 was developed and deployed during a war that killed millions. Its contribution to aviation history is significant, but we cannot forget the context in which it emerged. As we reflect on the first encounters with the Me-262, we should feel a sense of wonder at what was achieved. Engineers working with limited resources created something extraordinary. Pilots flying in desperate circumstances demonstrated exceptional skill, and the aircraft itself pushed the boundaries of what was possible. But we should also remember the larger lessons. Technology alone cannot ensure victory. Strategic situation, resources, and logistics matter more than any single weapon, and innovation must be timely to be effective. The Me-262 was a glimpse of the future, but it arrived when the present was already decided. Today, the few surviving Me-262s sit in museums. They are silent now, their engines cold. But they still speak to us across the decades. They tell a story of innovation and courage. They remind us of a pivotal moment in aviation history, and they stand as monuments to the pilots who flew them, both those who returned and those who did not. The world's first operational jet fighter changed aviation forever. It showed that the future belonged to jets, not propellers. It demonstrated new possibilities for speed and performance, and it left a legacy that continues to influence aircraft design today. The first encounters with the Me-262 were more than just combat engagements. They were meetings with the future, glimpses of what aviation would become, and in that sense, the Me-262's greatest impact was not on the war that was ending, but on the peace that would follow and the decades of aviation development that lay ahead. This has been the story of the Messerschmitt Me-262, the world's first operational jet fighter, and the remarkable first encounters that changed aviation history forever.